If you watched part 1, you know where we left off. Selene is gone. She walked out of that great hall in front of every noble, every commander, every rival pack leader who had spent months waiting for her to crack. And she didn't crack. She just left, with the heir the kingdom had been demanding she produce, with a plan she had been building quietly for months, with 3 riders waiting at the northern gate and the protection papers already sewn into the hem of her cloak. And Kael is standing in his palace with a transit seal in his hand, and the first real understanding that this isn't about politics anymore. So let's talk about what happens next, because this is where the story gets brutal in a different way. Not the cruelty of neglect, the cruelty of waking up. The confrontation happened on the 4th night after the transit seal discovery, late, long after the final council bells. Rain running down the tall palace windows in long silver lines. The western wing quiet, except for the distant sound of guards changing shifts. Kael found Selene in the map chamber adjoining the old royal library. Not the formal strategy hall, the smaller room behind it. The one for border records, diplomatic routes, old war maps, no longer considered politically useful enough for public display. 3 maps lay open on the central table: the northern coastlands, the eastern pine routes, the old Ashbourne trade passages. When he opened the door, her fingers paused briefly over one of the route markers, then continued moving calmly. She didn't startle. That unsettled him immediately. A guilty person startles. A prepared one doesn't. "You requested travel clearance," he said. No greeting, no warmth. The words landed like a drawn blade. "Yes," Selene said. Just yes. No explanation. No attempt to soften the truth. And somehow that disturbed him more than denial would have. For where? The northern territories. Why? She looked up. Candlelight moved across her face, touching the exhaustion beneath her eyes, the composure she wore almost constantly now, the stillness that had once belonged only to formal ceremonies and had somehow spread into every part of her. Kael realized suddenly that he couldn't remember the last time she had laughed freely in his presence. The realization struck him hard enough that he nearly lost the thread of what he was angry about. "Are you planning to leave?" he asked. The room went very still. Thunder somewhere beyond the western cliffs. Selene held his gaze for a long moment, not defensive, not frightened, only measuring whether truth still mattered enough between them to spend. "Then I'm preparing to survive. Not leaving, surviving." That word choice was deliberate, and they both knew it. Kael stared at her. Survive. When a kingdom begins discussing replacement wives before a marriage has even ended. Her fingers moved lightly across the northern routes. When council members speak of heirs as though women are breeding contracts, when your own husband hears it happening and says nothing. Now she looked at him. What exactly would you call preparation besides survival? Anger moved through him instinctively, not at her, at the accusation, at the implication, at the unbearable possibility that she was right. "I never allowed anyone to disrespect you," he said. Selene's expression shifted, not dramatically, just enough for something underneath to show. "That," she said quietly, "is not the same thing as protecting me." The rain deepened. Kael looked away. For years, he had survived conflict by turning everything into structure. Every difficult thing placed into categories neat enough to manage. But Selene didn't speak to him like a political opponent. She spoke like someone quietly burying something already dead. "You think I would cast you aside?" he asked. "I think you love this kingdom more than you know how to love anything else." Not cruel, just observed. That made it worse. "That's unfair." "Is it?" Silence. The candles shifted between them. Palace bells marked midnight somewhere beyond the walls. Selene looked tired suddenly. Soul-deep tired. The kind of exhaustion that comes from carrying disappointment carefully for too long. "I don't think you're evil, Kael." She said it like she meant it. And that alone was the hardest sentence in the room. "I think you were taught very young that caring openly was dangerous. And I think eventually you started confusing distance with strength." No council enemy had ever spoken to him that honestly. No military advisor would have dared. And there it was, the terrible thing he had been circling without naming. He had always believed Selene would stay, not because he'd consciously thought she belonged to him, because some quiet part of him had assumed her patience was unlimited, that she would simply continue waiting while he chose the kingdom first, over and over, until he was ready to stop. "What exactly are you preparing for?" he asked. Selene looked at him for a very long moment. Then she folded the northern map carefully. "One day," she said, "you're going to ask me a question you actually want the answer to." She gathered the remaining documents. "Until then, I think we're both pretending not to notice what this marriage has become." She walked past him toward the doorway. "Selene." She paused. He almost asked her to stay. The words rose inside him, actual words, not kingly ones, not political ones. "Stay." Not as Luna, not as symbol. "Stay because the room is colder when you leave it. Stay because I am beginning to understand something, and I am terrified it is too late." But Kael Ravencrest had spent too many years killing vulnerable instincts before they reached his mouth. So he said nothing. Selene waited one heartbeat, then kept walking. The door closed softly behind her. Kael stood alone in the map chamber, surrounded by roots leading north, and felt something dangerously close to helplessness. The discovery happened by accident. That was the worst part. Not confrontation, not confession, accident. 3 nights later, Kael went to the private archive to retrieve old military treaties for a border dispute. A restless night, unwilling to stare at palace ceilings, retrieving the records himself. The lower archive was nearly empty at that hour. One oil lamp, dust drifting through dim light, rows of ancient ledgers like silent witnesses. He moved through the shelves until he reached the Ashbourne lineage section, then stopped. A drawer stood slightly open, only slightly, enough to notice. He frowned. Selene hated disorder. Carelessness around records irritated her almost irrationally. He pulled the drawer open fully. Inside, parchment bundles, lineage confirmations, inheritance authorizations, medical certifications. One bore the private physician seal of the Royal Maternal Office. Kael stared at it, then reached for it slowly. The parchment crackled softly. He unfolded it. At first, his mind didn't process what it was reading. Royal Maternal Evaluation. Bloodline verification pending. Protective registration authorized under pre-unification law. He turned the page. Another seal. Another physician notation. Another bloodline certification request. And then the words that stopped him completely. Royal heir confirmed. Silence. Absolute silence. The oil lamp flickered beside the shelves. Rain tapped against the archive windows high above. Royal heir confirmed. His hand tightened around the page, then loosened immediately, terrified of damaging it. The realization came slowly at first, then all at once. Selene, the exhaustion, the hand always resting below her abdomen, the northern routes, the protection papers, the travel clearance, the moon chapel, the distance, the survival. Oh gods! Kael sat down hard in the nearest chair, without remembering deciding to move. Royal heir confirmed. Not possibility, not suspicion. Confirmed. A child, his child, their child. And Selene had told no one. Worse, she had hidden it from him, not out of cruelty, out of fear. He closed his eyes briefly, and in that moment, Alpha King Kael Ravencrest felt something inside himself begin to fracture. Not because he was becoming a father, because the woman carrying his child believed she needed protection from the kingdom he ruled, and perhaps from him. Beneath the physician's seal, another document was attached by black cord. Emergency maternal protection authorization. Approved by Elder Midwife Council. Northern transit recognition granted. Kael's stomach dropped. Not preparation. Execution. Selene was not considering leaving. She had already arranged how. Then he noticed the second cabinet. Unlocked. Barely open. He crossed the chamber and pulled it fully open. Inside, dozens of bundled files arranged with meticulous precision. Not royal archives. Private records. Selene's records. He reached for the nearest ledger. His hands were not entirely steady. The first document was a border stabilization agreement between Blackthorn and the northern coast settlements. Signed, sealed, operational for 11 months. Kael stared at it. He had never seen this agreement before. a second file. Village protection reallocations for the eastern lowlands. Winter casualty prevention successful. Supply shortages reduced by 60%. Authorized under Luna administrative privilege. A third, Treasury route restructuring. Revised escort system. 3 robbery attempts prevented through route rotation adjustments. A fourth, quiet negotiations with the western border clans after a failed assassination attempt against a minor noble house. The attack had never reached the public. Selene had contained it before it escalated. Kael kept reading. Peace treaties, trade stabilization, military corrections, supply protections, border reforms, quiet interventions that had prevented conflict before conflict became visible enough for kings to notice. All organized, all completed, all signed beneath Selene's authority. And suddenly, he understood something horrifying. For 4 years, he had believed Selene existed beside the throne. But she had been holding part of the kingdom together underneath it, silently, without recognition, without praise, without him. The realization hollowed him out. He sat surrounded by evidence of a life he had never truly seen. Not because it was hidden, because he had never looked deeply enough to notice it. He picked up another report. Village reconstruction funding. A winter flood in the southern valleys. 83 displaced families relocated before first frost. He remembered hearing about the flood. One paragraph during a military briefing. He remembered dismissing it as administratively resolved. Administratively resolved. The phrase sickened him now, because administration had a face, a voice, hands stained with ink late into the night while he sat in council chambers believing his wife ceremonial. Then he saw the journals, 7 of them, bound in dark leather, neatly stacked beneath the records. No royal seal, no classification marks, private. He stared at them for a long time without touching them. Something inside him already knew these would be worse than the physician report. He reached for the first one anyway. The leather was worn at the edges, not neglected, used, loved carefully. The early pages were ordinary, border observations, trade notes, supply concerns. Small daily records in Selene's elegant hand. But slowly, the entries changed. Not dramatically. That was the terrible part. There was no bitterness sharpened for revenge. No rage. No theatrical grief. Only honesty. And honesty, Kael discovered that night, was far more devastating. One entry described standing beside him during a winter military ceremony, while snow gathered in the folds of his black cloak. You looked tired tonight. I wanted to touch your hand. I did not because I could no longer tell whether comfort would burden you more than loneliness already does. Kael closed his eyes briefly, then kept reading. Another entry. The council praised my diplomacy with the eastern houses today. Kael nodded once afterward, as though approving a military report. I spent the rest of the evening ashamed of how much that small acknowledgement mattered to me. Another, he asked tonight whether the western roads were stable. I answered for 15 minutes. He listened carefully to every word. It should not feel extraordinary when your husband listens to you. I wish it did not. Hours passed unnoticed. The storm deepened. The oil lamp dimmed. Still Kael read. He read about border villages, about winter relief caravans, about sleepless nights balancing treasury shortages, about political negotiations she never informed him of because she no longer believed he wanted to know. And threaded through all of it him, always him, not obsessively, not dramatically. Simply present the way grief becomes present in a life, constant enough that eventually it blends into ordinary breathing. Then he reached the 5th journal. The entries were quieter here, more tired, the handwriting slightly less controlled, as though maintaining composure on paper had started costing her more energy than she had. Then he found the entry, halfway down the page. No introduction, no flourish, just a sentence waiting calmly between observations about court diplomacy and winter grain reserves. He read it once, then stopped breathing entirely. I think the cruelest thing is not that he stopped loving me. The candle flickered. Rain whispered at the windows. He continued reading. It's that he never noticed when I stopped asking him to. Silence, absolute silence. The sentence shattered something inside him completely. Not because she accused him, because she didn't. The entry continued afterward with practical observations about northern trade shipments, as though she had not just placed her entire heartbreak quietly onto the page, and then kept working. Kael stared at the line for a very long time, because suddenly he understood, not theoretically, completely, that somewhere inside these 4 years, Selene had stopped reaching for him, and he hadn't even noticed it happening. He lowered the journal. One hand covered his mouth. He had survived assassinations, battles, funerals, civil unrest, political betrayals. None of it had prepared him for this, because none of it had required him to confront the possibility that he himself had become the wound. He sat there in the archive, surrounded by evidence of a woman who had loved him carefully, until love itself became too painful to keep offering, and the Alpha King of Blackthorn Dominion fell apart silently beside a stack of journals nobody had intended him to read. The palace exploded at dawn, not loudly at first. Palaces don't erupt loudly in the beginning. First, it was the missing servants, then the absent carriage, then the discovery that Selene's personal attendants had vanished from the eastern wing before sunrise. Then the guards at the northern gate admitted, under questioning, that sealed royal travel authorization had passed through during the 4th watch of the night. By morning council, the whispers had become panic. The Luna was gone, and worse, no one knew where. Kael entered the council chamber, carrying 3 of Selene's journals under his arm. No one noticed at first. The room was already in chaos. Noble houses arguing, commanders demanding border closures, rain-soaked messengers kneeling before the council fire. Lord Malric stood near the central table issuing orders with terrifying efficiency. Seal the eastern roads. Double watch at the southern ports. No traveler leaves Blackthorn territory unverified. Then Kael spoke. Stop. The room froze. Everyone turned. Kael looked exhausted. Not physically, spiritually. The kind of exhaustion that changes a man's face permanently. Malric stepped forward. My king, we still have time if the northern routes are blocked quickly. No. That one word landed like stone, dropped from a height. Malric blinked. They are not to be hunted, Kael said. A commander spoke carefully. My king, the Luna may be carrying state-sensitive records. Kael looked at him. Then at the council table. Then at the nobles, already calculating political disaster behind frightened eyes. She is carrying my wife, he said quietly. Nobody moved. Then and my child. The chamber went dead silent. Malric's face lost color. A noblewoman near the western benches dropped her goblet. Wine spread slowly across the stone floor, unnoticed. Kael watched the realization move through the room. The Luna had not failed to produce an heir. The kingdom had driven away its future, and the Alpha King hadn't even known. The humiliation of it struck the court like a physical thing, not just scandal, weakness. Kings are supposed to know about threats, about succession, about their own households. Kael stood at the center of the chamber while his authority cracked visibly around him for the first time since his coronation. And somewhere inside that humiliation, something colder settled into him. Not shame, understanding. Because this was no longer about public perception. Selene had looked at Blackthorn Dominion and decided her child would be safer beyond its borders than inside his reach. That truth would haunt him for the rest of his life. A border rider arrived before dusk, mud-covered, half-frozen. His horse had collapsed in the lower courtyard. The rider was brought before the council fire, still dripping rainwater. Kael stood before him, silent. My king, the rider swallowed once. The northern crossing was reached at dawn. Kael waited. The Ashbourne Passage seals were honored under old border law. A pause. She crossed the northern border 3 hours before our riders arrived. 3 hours. 3 hours too late. Selene was not missing. She was gone. Beyond Blackthorn authority. Beyond immediate pursuit. Beyond the kingdom he had chosen over her too many times, across too many council sessions, in too many empty corridors. Kael stood very still beside the council fire, and somewhere far north, beneath the same storm-dark sky, the woman he loved, without understanding it, until it was almost destroyed, was carrying his child farther away from him with every passing mile. After the rider left, Kael did not chase her. That was the first thing that made the court afraid. Not because anyone doubted his will. They had seen him end rebellions before sunrise, stare down rival alphas, bury grief, and command armies without flinching. But that night, after hearing that Selene had crossed the border 3 hours before royal guards arrived, the Alpha King didn't shout, didn't order pursuit, didn't overturn the council table. He turned and walked out of the chamber without explanation. He walked through Blackthorn Palace like a man moving through a battlefield after the bodies had already been carried away. Everything looked the same. That was the cruelty of it. Same stone floors, same winter torches, same banners stitched with Ravencrest victories. The same corridors where Selene had walked beside him for 4 years, close enough to touch, far enough to disappear. He reached the Queen's wing near midnight. Her chamber door stood open, not wide, not dramatic, just open, as though the room had stopped pretending it was occupied. Kael stood at the threshold for a long time before entering. Her scent remained moonflower soap, ink, the faint trace of winter air that always clung to her cloak after she walked the gardens. The room was orderly, of course it was. Selene had not left in panic. She had left with the exactness of a woman who had understood for weeks that chaos was a luxury she couldn't afford. The bed was made, the wardrobe half empty, but not ransacked, the desk drawers closed, the fire burned down to red glow, and on the dressing table, her moonstone circlet rested in its velvet case. Kael crossed to it slowly. He remembered the night she first wore it. Their wedding reception. Not a feast of joy, a negotiation with music. She had stood beside him beneath 2 flags that had once met only across battlefields, wearing white silk and that pale circlet, while nobles from both houses measured whether peace could survive 2 proud bloodlines sharing a table. He had told himself then that keeping his distance was honest. That warmth would create expectations he might fail to meet. That maintaining control was the responsible choice. Looking at the circlet lying abandoned in its case, he understood distance had not been honesty. It had been cowardice dressed as discipline. He touched the edge of the moonstone once, then withdrew his hand. On the desk, beneath a paperweight shaped like an ash leaf, lay a folded parchment. He recognized her handwriting before he reached it. His chest tightened, but when he opened it, it was not a farewell. It was a nursery inventory. Small cradle, winter blankets, soft linen wraps, medicinal herbs, moon thread charm, 3 sets of infant clothing. Kael stared at the list. The words blurred. He read them again. 3 sets of infant clothing. He turned from the desk and saw the small cedar chest near the far wall. He had walked past it 100 times, never opened it, never asked. Now it seemed to fill the entire room. He crossed to it. The lid opened without sound. Inside, folded with Selene's precise care, lay 3 tiny garments, one white, one gray, one pale blue, each no larger than his 2 hands. For a moment, Kael didn't understand what he was seeing. Not truly. He knew. But knowing and understanding are not the same thing. He reached down and lifted the gray one. The fabric was impossibly soft, too small, too real. Something inside him broke. Not loudly, not with collapse. Kael Ravencrest did not fall to the floor or cry out her name. He simply stood in the silent chamber of the wife he had not protected, holding his unborn child's clothing in both hands, and finally understood that the future he had treated as a political necessity had already had a mother folding clothes for it in secret. Selene had prepared tenderness, while he prepared succession. She had prepared blankets, while the council prepared bloodline claims. She had prepared escape, because he had prepared nothing that felt like safety. He lowered himself into the chair beside the cedar chest. He sat there until the hearth went cold. At dawn, he walked the gardens alone. No guards. That frightened the palace more than anything. Selene had restored the Queen's garden in their 2nd year. He had signed the budget request without reading the details. Now he really looked. The paths repaired with pale stone from Ashbourne territory. The dead fountain rebuilt. Winter roses climbing the south wall. Small iron lanterns hanging from a sleeping willow. On the bench at the center, a bench he had never once sat on, lay another folded paper. Not a letter, notes, garden modifications for a child's safety. Remove broken fountain edge before spring. Lower west lantern hooks. Check if willow branches are strong enough for swing. Ask Mara whether children prefer open garden paths or hidden corners. Kael read the last line 3 times. Children, not heirs, children. He sat on the bench, the one he had never used, and a king with a kingdom unraveling, and a wife gone and a child he hadn't known existed yesterday sat in the frost and tried to figure out what kind of man he wanted to be. The council had regrouped by mid-morning. They sent a formal request for his presence regarding urgent matters of succession security. Kael almost laughed at the phrasing. His wife had fled into winter carrying his child, and the council still only had one language for loss. He entered the council chamber near noon. Every seat filled. Commanders, noble advisors, priests, territorial representatives. Lord Malric standing beside the central table with the calm readiness of a man who has prepared several arguments and believes at least one of them will survive contact with grief. Kael wore no ceremonial cloak, no crown, no royal chain, only dark riding clothes and the Ravencrest signet. That absence unsettled them more than anger would have. Malric bowed, "My king." Kael did not sit, speak. "The situation requires decisive action," Malric said. The Luna has removed herself from Blackthorn territory while carrying the confirmed royal heir. Whatever private circumstances led to this moment, the kingdom cannot permit uncertainty regarding the succession. Several council members nodded, not eagerly, cautiously. A military commander spoke. We can send riders through the western passes, quietly, no banners. No, Kael said. A priest cleared his throat. My king, the unborn child, is not merely private blood. Kael turned his eyes toward him. The priest fell silent. The heir belongs to no one, Kael said quietly, who has not first learned how to protect the child as a child. Malric's expression tightened. With respect, that is sentiment. Kael looked at him. For 4 years, Malric had stood near the throne like a second shadow, whispering necessity, shaping fear into policy, calling tenderness weakness until Kael had mistaken hardness for wisdom. Now he saw him clearly, not as the creator of his failures. That would have been too easy. Malric had not made him neglect Selene. Malric had only given his neglect a language that sounded like duty. Kael had chosen to speak it. That was the harder truth. Do you know what I found in her chamber? Kael asked. Malric did not answer. Infant clothes, garden plans, nursery lists, protection records, journals documenting 4 years of work this council benefited from and never thought to credit because the woman doing it was easier to call ceremonial. A few wolves lowered their eyes. Kael's voice remained even. That made it worse. You speak of reclaiming the Luna as though she is a misplaced seal. You speak of the heir as though my child is a treaty clause. You speak of succession as though the kingdom has been wronged. He stepped toward the table. The kingdom was not wronged. His hand came down on the old wood, not hard enough to break it, hard enough to be felt. The kingdom wronged her. No one answered. Malric regrouped quickly. And what would you have us do, my king? Leave the royal heir beyond reach. Allow Ashbourne territory to control the future of Blackthorn Dominion. There it was, power or Selene, throne or family. The same choice returned to him in formal language. But this time, Selene was not there to be wounded by his answer. Only absent, only gone, only carrying the consequence of every previous silence. Kael walked toward the throne seat. Black carved wood, raven wings etched into the arms, a chair built to make men forget they were still men. For one breath, the council thought he meant to sit. He did not. He stood beside it, then removed the Ravencrest signet from his hand. The room froze. Malric went very still. My king. Kael placed the ring on the table. The small sound it made was worse than shouting. I will not hunt my wife. A noble elder rose halfway. Your Majesty, I will not drag the mother of my child back to a palace she had to escape to feel safe. And I will not secure a throne by becoming the reason my son begins his life as a captive. The word son entered the room before anyone was prepared for it. Kael had not known the child's sex, but in that moment, the word came from somewhere deeper than certainty. Malric stared at the ring. You cannot abandon the throne. I am not abandoning it. Kael's eyes moved across the council. I am leaving Prince Eric as regent until my return. The council will obey him under wartime continuity law. Any attempt to move against Ashbourne territory, Selene, or the child without my explicit command will be treated as treason. A shock passed through the chamber. Malric's face hardened. You planned this. No, Kael said. Selene planned survival. I am learning from her. That sentence ended the room. Not politically, emotionally, because every wolf there understood what it meant. The Alpha King had chosen, not perfectly, not soon enough, but publicly, and not the throne. He left Blackthorn Dominion before sunset. No royal escort, no military column, no banners, no announcement. One horse, one winter cloak, a small travel pack, and the physician report folded inside his coat like a wound he chose to carry. At the northern gate, Captain Oren waited with 6 mounted guards. We are ready, my king. Kael looked at the men, loyal, armed, prepared to follow, prepared to become the very thing Selene had fled if he allowed it. No, he said. Oren frowned. That is unsafe. There are worse things than unsafe. The captain glanced toward the road. Snow beginning, light at first, then thickening. The northern passes are difficult this time of year. I know. You may not reach her before. Kael looked at him. Oren stopped. Before what? Before birth. Before forgiveness disappeared. Before the distance became permanent. Before Kael discovered that choosing her now didn't entitle him to be chosen in return. He mounted without another word. At the gate, he looked back once. Blackthorn Palace rose behind him, dark against the winter sky. Every tower familiar, every window part of the life he had believed was the center of everything. It looked smaller from the saddle. That frightened him and freed him. He turned north. The journey took 12 days. The first 3 were through Blackthorn land, where every innkeeper recognized him and pretended not to stare at the absence of banners. The next 4 crossed old Ashbourne roads, where recognition became colder, more complicated. At one village, an old woman refused his coin after serving him stew. Your money's royal, she said, but the hurt you're carrying looks personal. Kael accepted the words without defense. That was new. At another crossing, a border guard delayed him for 6 hours despite knowing exactly who he was. Old law, the guard said. Kael did not threaten him. Also new. He waited in the snow until the papers were stamped and returned. Each delay became its own education. Kings hate waiting because waiting proves the world continues without their permission. Kael learned that slowly, in the snow, with no crown and no command, and nothing to do but sit with his own choices. On the 9th night, he slept in a roadside chapel with no fire. He dreamed of Selene standing at the end of a long corridor, one hand over her abdomen, not running from him, just walking away at a pace he could never quite match. He woke before dawn, with her name in his mouth. By the 12th day, the land changed. The northern coastlands didn't look like Blackthorn Dominion. No black stone, no war banners, no iron gates, only pale cliffs, wind-bent grass, gray sea, and small houses built low against weather that had no respect for crowns. He found the house near sunset, small, stone-walled, set back from the cliff road with smoke rising from one chimney, a line of winter linens moving in the sea wind, herbs hanging beside the door, a midwife's mark carved into the lintel. Kael stopped at the edge of the path. For a moment, he couldn't move. He had commanded armies into battle with less fear than he felt approaching that door. Then he saw her through the window. Selene, seated beside the hearth, pale, tired, alive, hair loose over one shoulder, a blanket around her, and in her arms, a child. Kael's hand tightened around the reins. The world narrowed to the small bundle resting against her chest. A newborn, his son, their son. Selene looked down at the child with an expression he had never seen on her face before. Not the court smile, not the ceremonial calm, not the careful dignity of a woman protecting herself in hostile rooms. This was softer, deeper, complete in a way that didn't require him. That realization hurt, and it was right that it hurt. Kael dismounted slowly. No army, no banners, no council language to protect him. Only the man he was when stripped of throne and title and command. He walked to the door, raised his hand, stopped. In that moment, he understood that knocking was not a formality. It was a request, and Selene had every right not to answer. He knocked once, then waited. Inside, movement, a low voice, the soft cry of a newborn disturbed from sleep. The door opened. Selene stood before him, holding their son against her chest. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. The sea wind moved between them. Kael looked at the child, then at her. There were 1,000 things he wanted to say. I'm sorry. I was wrong. I came alone. I choose you. Please. But none of them came first. Because for the first time, Kael understood that his need to speak did not outrank her right to silence. Selene looked at him calmly, not coldly, calmly. The baby shifted in her arms. You came alone, she said. Yes. A pause. No banners. No soldiers. No. Her eyes searched his face, perhaps looking for the king, perhaps measuring how much of the man remained. And why did you come, Kael? The question was quiet, but it was not gentle. He swallowed once. The wind moved hard across the cliffs behind him. He had crossed kingdoms to reach this door, but the hardest distance remained directly in front of him. "I came," he said slowly, "because I finally understand that a throne can be inherited." His voice caught. "Only once, but safety has to be earned." Selene looked at him for a long time, then down at the child. The newborn stirred, one tiny hand pressing against the blanket, as if testing the air of the world he had just entered. Kael took half a step forward without thinking. Selene did not step back, but she did not move aside either. The doorway remained between them. That mattered. It mattered more than anything he had imagined on the road north. She had opened the door. She had not invited him in. And standing there in the salt wind, with his son sleeping in the arms of the woman he had chosen too late, Kael Ravencrest understood that arriving was not the same as being welcomed. Not yet. Selene did not invite him inside that first evening. Kael stood at the doorway of the small coastal house while the wind came in from the gray sea. The sky darkening, the sun slipping behind winter clouds, the edges of the cliffs turning the color of old iron. Inside, the hearth burned low and steady. Outside, the Alpha King of Blackthorn Dominion stood with salt wind on his cloak and no authority that mattered. Selene held their son against her chest. The child slept through most of it, wrapped in pale wool, one tiny fist beneath his cheek. His face was still too new to carry either bloodline clearly. Not Ravencrest yet, not Ashbourne yet, only himself, only a life that had done nothing but arrive, and already carried the weight of kingdoms he had never asked for. Kael looked at him and felt something break open in a place power had never reached. A throne could be defended. A child could only be protected. The difference shamed him. Selene noticed him looking. She adjusted the blanket around the baby's shoulder, not possessively, but with the practiced certainty of a mother who had already learned the rhythm of this small body before the father had learned his name. "What did you name him?" Kael asked. A pause. "Elias." The name entered the air between them gently. Not royal, not political, not pulled from the long list of Ravencrest kings carved into Blackthorn's ancestral hall. Elias, a name that belonged first to a boy, not a crown. Kael lowered his eyes. "It suits him. I know. No cruelty in it. Only the quiet authority of someone who had made choices alone because she had needed to." For a long moment, they stood with the doorway between them, Selene inside the warmth she had built, Kael outside in the cold he had earned. Then the baby stirred. A small sound, not a cry, just a question shaped like breath. Kael looked at him instinctively. The movement was so unguarded that Selene saw it before he could compose himself. Something shifted in her face. Not forgiveness, not yet, but recognition. "You may come in," she said. Kael stepped over the threshold as though crossing into a sacred space. He removed his cloak without being asked and hung it by the door. He did not inspect the house like territory. He stood near the entrance until Selene moved first. The room was small: hearth, table, 3 chairs, cradle by the fire, herbs on a shelf near the window, a writing desk facing the sea. Nothing in it existed to impress anyone, and for that reason, everything in it felt more honest than half the rooms in Blackthorn Palace. Selene sat near the hearth. Kael remained standing. "You can sit," she said. He did, not opposite her like a king receiving a report. At the side, near enough to hear, far enough not to claim. For several minutes, neither spoke. The hearth settled, wind at the shutters. Elias slept. And in that quiet, Kael understood something he should have understood years ago. Presence was not a speech. It was not an apology. It was staying in the room without demanding to be absolved. Selene broke the silence. "Why did you really come?" He held the question before answering it. He had answered too many things quickly in his life. Laws, wars, council pressure. Praised for decisive judgment, until he'd forgotten some questions deserved to be held first. "Because I was wrong," he said. "That is not enough." "I know." She looked slightly surprised. Only slightly. Kael looked at his hands. Too large in this room. Hands that had signed execution orders, commanded armies, held kingdoms together. Hands that had never learned how to hold tenderness without making it useful. "I loved power," he said quietly, "because power was easier. Kingdoms obey if you make the consequences clear. Councils fall silent if your voice is cold enough. Soldiers follow banners. Fear is simple." His jaw tightened once. But love required presence, attention, patience, the willingness to be changed by someone else's pain before it became convenient to notice. Selene looked away briefly, not to reject the words, to survive them. "I knew how to rule a kingdom," Kael continued, voice lower. "I never learned how to stay." The sentence remained in the room. No music, no sudden tears, no wound this deep heals because a man finally found the right arrangement of words. But the truth had been spoken. That mattered. Not enough, but something. "You speak as if not knowing excuses it," Selene said. "No." "Good." She adjusted Elias against her shoulder. The baby's cheek rested against her collarbone, unaware of all the history standing around him. "I believed you would protect the throne before you protected us," she said. "Yes, I believed if I stayed, this child would become a symbol before he became a son. Yes, I believed your counsel would turn my motherhood into succession policy before I had even learned how to hold him without fear." Kael closed his eyes briefly, then opened them. "Yes." Selene studied him for a long moment. Pain in her face now. The private kind, the kind she had denied the court for 4 years. "You made me carry joy like contraband," she said. That broke him more than anger would have. Kael bowed his head. For a moment, he could not speak. When he did, his voice was rougher. "I know." "No," Selene said softly. You know now. Merciless, fair, exact. Yes, he said, I know now. Silence returned. Full this time, not empty. Full of everything neither of them could repair in one evening. Then Elias began to fuss. Selene shifted him, humming under her breath. Not a court song. Something old and ashborn, with a melody that moved like wind through pine trees. Kael listened. His son quieted. Grief moved through him then. For the lullabies he had missed before knowing there were lullabies to miss. When Elias settled, Selene spoke without looking at Kael. There will be conditions. He straightened, not defensively, attentively. No political control over Elias. Yes, you do not announce him to the kingdom without my permission. Yes, you do not send guards here. Yes, you do not place him in Blackthorn Palace as a royal possession. Yes, if he ever enters your court, it will be because I decide he is safe there. And when he is old enough, because he chooses it. Yes, no council claims over my life. No public declaration implying I have returned to you. Yes, he said, then quieter, yes. Selene's fingers moved over the baby's blanket. And trust will not be restored because you crossed a border. I know it will not be restored because you came alone. I know it will not be restored because you finally understand what you should have understood before I had to leave. She looked at him, searching for the old impatience, the kingly instinct to negotiate pain into something more convenient. It didn't appear, only grief, and the kind of attention she had once begged for in silence, now offered too late to earn anything quickly, which was precisely why it mattered. Then you may hold him. Kael went completely still. Selene rose and crossed the small space between them. For the first time since he arrived, she came toward him. Kael started to stand, then stopped himself. No, let her choose. Let her decide how the child passed from her arms to his. She noticed something crossed her face. Approval, maybe, or pain, or both. She placed Elias carefully into Kael's arms. The child was lighter than anything that had ever frightened him so deeply. Kael held him badly at first, too stiff, too cautious. Selene adjusted his arm. Support his head. He obeyed immediately. Elias shifted, opened his eyes briefly, and looked at him with unfocused, newborn solemnity. Kael forgot how to breathe. No council chamber had ever silenced him like that. No army, no enemy, no throne. Only this small boy, warm and alive, pressing one tiny hand against the blanket, as though testing the air of the world he had just entered. Kael bowed his head, not for the court, for his son, and Selene, standing beside him, saw the first tear fall silently onto the edge of the pale blanket. She did not comfort him. Some reckonings must be allowed to arrive fully. He held Elias for 7 minutes. Selene counted without meaning to. Then she took him back when the baby rooted restlessly toward her. Kael released him immediately. That mattered too. By morning, Kael left the coastal house, not because he wanted to, because staying without invitation would have turned remorse back into entitlement. At the door, Selene stood with Elias in her arms. The sea wind moved behind Kael, carrying salt and winter grass. "I'll return to Blackthorn," he said. Her expression closed slightly. "For how long?" "As long as it takes to make the throne less dangerous to him." She watched him carefully, and to me. Kael held her gaze. "To you first." He bowed his head, not deeply enough to perform, just enough to mean it. Then he turned and walked back toward the northern road. This time he looked back once, at the bend. Selene was still in the doorway. She did not wave, but she remained. For now, that was more mercy than he deserved. The return to Blackthorn took longer, not because of weather, because Kael stopped rushing. He stayed 2 nights in villages Selene had once protected through trade reforms. He spoke to border mothers. He listened to local physicians. He visited a school funded under a budget line he had signed without reading. Everywhere he went, he found traces of her. Not monuments, not declarations. Work, the kind that doesn't announce itself because it is too busy keeping people alive. By the time he reached the palace, the council had prepared arguments. Kael prepared law. The first decree stripped the council of unilateral authority over royal children below 16. The second recognized maternal guardianship in cases where court politics endangered a child's welfare. The third established that succession could be deferred until the heir was old enough to consent to public recognition. The fourth removed Lord Malric from succession advisory power pending inquiry. Malric received the news at dusk in the upper council chamber. "You are weakening the throne," he said. Kael sat at the head of the table. For the first time in years, the chair didn't seem to own him. "No," Kael said. "I am preventing it from devouring my son." Malric's mouth tightened. "And if the noble houses rebel, then for once they'll rebel because I protected my family, not because I sacrificed it." The inquiry into Malric uncovered more than political pressure. Letters to rival houses. Marriage negotiations drafted before Selene left. Succession alternatives prepared without royal approval. Nothing shocking enough to surprise Kael now, only enough to confirm what Selene had seen long before he had. Malric was removed quietly, not executed. That would have been the old Kael. Instead, exiled to the eastern monastery estates, stripped of court authority, watched by wolves who couldn't be bought. Blackthorn Dominion changed slowly after that. Not beautifully, not without resistance, but truly. Kael wrote to Selene once a week. Not requests, not pleas, letters. He wrote about the laws he changed, the resistance he faced, the village school in the southern valley. The first time he held court without Malric standing behind his right shoulder. and realized how much of his own thinking had not been fully his. He wrote about Elias only when Selene mentioned him first. He never asked for more than she offered. Selene answered when she chose, sometimes after 2 weeks, sometimes 6. Her letters were short at first. Elias is well. The coastal weather is poor. He sleeps better near the hearth. Then slowly more. He dislikes being wrapped too tightly. He calms when Mara sings. He sneezed today and looked personally offended by it. Kael read that last line 6 times, then laughed alone in his study for the first time in years. Winter passed, then spring, then the first part of summer. He visited only when invited. The first visits were brief, an hour, then 2, then an afternoon. He learned how to hold Elias properly, how to warm milk without overheating it, how to walk the room when the baby refused sleep, how to leave when Selene grew tired instead of waiting for her to ask him to. That last one was perhaps the hardest lesson. Presence, he learned, required attention not only to when you arrive, but to when you should go. Months later, winter returned to the coast. The cliffs wore frost again. The sea turned dark and restless. Smoke rose from the chimney of the small stone house. Kael arrived at the edge of the coastal path just before sunset. This time, a messenger had gone ahead 2 days earlier. This time, Selene had answered, "You may come after the evening meal." So he came after the evening meal, not before, not with gifts large enough to become pressure. Only a small wooden wolf he had carved badly during council recesses and nearly thrown into the fire twice because one leg was shorter than the others. He stood at the gate, not at the door. The gate, another lesson learned. The house door opened. Selene stepped out. Dark blue dress under a wool shawl, hair braided loosely. The winter wind moved around her, but she didn't hurry. Behind her, in the warm square of doorway light, Mara held Elias on her hip. The boy was larger now, round-cheeked, bright-eyed, stubborn in the chin already. Kael felt something twist in his chest. Selene opened the gate herself. Not dramatic, not a declaration, only a small hinge moving in the cold. But Kael understood by now that healing often arrives like that, not as thunder, as permission. "You're late by 3 minutes," she said. No accusation, almost humor. The road was iced near the eastern bend. "I know. I told you to watch for it." "You did. And yet," "I watched badly." For 1 second, Selene's mouth softened. Not quite a smile, but the memory of one. Kael held out the wooden wolf. "It's poorly made. I can see that. I brought it anyway." This time she did smile. Small, real, brief enough that another man might have missed it. Kael didn't. From the doorway, Elias made a sound, not a word, not yet, but recognition. He reached both arms toward Kael with the absolute authority of a child who has decided what he wants. and sees no reason the world should delay in providing it. Kael stopped breathing. Selene turned. Mara looked at her. For a moment, no one moved. Then Selene nodded once. Mara brought Elias forward. The boy leaned so hard toward Kael that Mara laughed under her breath and surrendered him carefully into his father's arms. Kael held him close. Elias grabbed at his collar, then his hair, then the edge of his jaw. Kael let him. He would have let the child dismantle every crown in Blackthorn if those small hands had asked it of him. Selene watched them. A year ago, Kael would have stood tall beneath that gaze, tried to look worthy, controlled, strong. Instead, with Elias in his arms, he lowered himself to one knee in the frost-covered path. Not because he was proposing, not because he was performing. Because his son had dropped the crooked wooden wolf, and kneeling was the easiest way to pick it up without shifting him. That was the visible reason. The deeper one was quieter. For the first time in the story, Kael Ravencrest did not stand above the people he loved. He knelt. Selene saw it. Kael knew she saw it. He picked up the wooden wolf and placed it gently into Elias' hands. The boy immediately tried to fit one uneven ear into his mouth. Kael laughed softly. Selene shook her head. He will ruin it. It may improve it. This time her smile stayed longer. Not long enough to become certainty, but long enough to become hope. Behind them, the small coastal house glowed with firelight. Beyond them, the sea moved under winter stars. Far away, Blackthorn Dominion still stood with its black towers and old laws and altered throne, not healed completely, not remade overnight, but changed. Because one woman had refused to let her child be swallowed by power, and one man had finally learned that ruling was not the same as staying. Selene stepped back toward the open door. "You may come in," she said. Kael looked up from where he knelt in the frost, his son warm and laughing in his arms. This time, the invitation was not surrender, not forgiveness completed, not a promise that the pain had vanished or the distance was forgotten. It was a door opened by choice, and that made it worth more than any throne he had ever sat on. Kael rose slowly, not as king, as father, as a man still learning, as someone who understood at last that a throne can command a room, but it cannot hold a family. Only presence can do that. Only humility. Only the daily willingness to earn what power can never force. He crossed the threshold after Selene, not ahead of her, not beside her yet. After, and for now, that was exactly where he belonged.